Story number 1: The Silent Watcher. Samantha had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the quiet of her room at night, the stillness of the house, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen downstairs. It was all comforting, or at least it used to be. For weeks now, things had felt different. At first, it was subtle, almost like she was imagining it. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time she turned off the lights, tucked herself into bed and closed her eyes to sleep, there was this sense that she wasn't alone. It started with the whispers. Soft, barely audible, but there. A faint rustling in the corner of her room, a shuffle on the floor, a breath. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Just the same empty room, the same dark corners, and her own racing heart. The first night it happened, she thought it was just the wind, or maybe some creaky floorboards. But the feeling lingered. It didn't feel like a draft or the house settling. No, it felt like eyes, watching her, observing her every move, even in her most private moments. Her skin would crawl when she'd lie in bed, waiting for sleep to come. The hairs on the back of her neck would stand up, and she could almost feel the weight of someone's stare on her. Each night it grew worse. The cold breath on the back of her neck became more noticeable, more deliberate. Sometimes she could even feel it brushing against her ear. The silence of the room, once peaceful, became oppressive. It was like the quiet was waiting for something, or someone. Samantha would turn, her heart in her throat, but each time she was met with nothing but the same empty shadows in the corners of her room. No one was there, but she knew someone was. The fear twisted inside her. Then came the night that would change everything. It was like any other night, with the lights dimmed low, her room drowned in shadows. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing sleep to come when it happened. She felt it again, the cold breath against her neck. Only this time, it wasn't just the usual fleeting sensation. It lingered. A chill ran down her spine, but she didn't move. Not at first. She was too afraid to look, too afraid of what she might see. The minutes dragged on. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then, almost as if the air itself had changed, Samantha slowly turned her head toward the foot of her bed. And there it was. A figure. Dark, still, like it had always been there, standing motionless at the foot of her bed. She couldn't make out any details. It was just a silhouette against the faint light coming from the street lamp outside her window. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was just there, staring at her, watching her. Her breath hitched in her throat. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. She wanted to scream, but her mouth was dry, her voice lost somewhere deep in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body was frozen. It was as though the figure was sucking the life out of her, draining her of all energy, all strength. And yet, it never came closer. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, when the figure didn't move or make any sound, when it seemed like time itself had stopped, Samantha's mind snapped. She grabbed the blanket and pulled it over her head, clutching it like a lifeline. She shut her eyes tightly, praying that when she opened them again, it would be gone. But she knew it wouldn't be. The next morning, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a dream, she thought. Maybe she'd imagined it in the half-light, her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't alone, and whatever had been watching her was still there, waiting. Samantha could no longer sleep in peace. Every night the figure would return, standing at the foot of her bed, silent, unmoving, watching. She tried to leave the house, tried to escape the feeling, but no matter where she went, the feeling followed. It wasn't just in her room, it was inside her. The Watcher was with her, a part of her life now. Samantha would never be alone again. And somewhere in the darkness, the silent Watcher waited, knowing that it was only a matter of time before she had nowhere left to run. Story number 2. The Shadows in the Closet. Michael had always dreamed of a fresh start. After years of struggling in the cramped apartment, he and his wife, Claire, had finally found the perfect house. It was an old house, sure, but there was something charming about it. The creaky floors, the smell of wood, the quiet street it sat on. It felt like the perfect place to build a life, a place where they could leave the past behind and focus on their future together. They moved in, unpacked their boxes, and settled into the cozy bedroom on the second floor. The room had a large closet, big enough for all their clothes, shoes, and a few odds and ends. At first, Michael thought nothing of it. It was just a closet, right? A place to hang their coats and store their old things. But something about it felt off. Every time Michael opened the door to hang a shirt or grab a jacket, there was this feeling. It was like the closet was watching him, waiting. But when he glanced inside, it was empty. Nothing but shelves and hangers. Still, the feeling nagged at him. Claire didn't seem to notice anything strange about the closet. She'd even jokingly say that Michael was just being paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it started with small noises. Scratching, shuffling. It was faint at first, like something moving around in the walls. Michael would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. But then the noises grew louder. Scratching. Scratching that sounded almost alive, like claws against the wood. Michael would get up, groggy, and open the closet door. But each time, there was nothing. Just the empty shelves, the hanging clothes swaying slightly, as if the wind had blown through the room. One night, as Michael lay in bed, the sounds grew even more intense. There was something in the closet, he could feel it. The scratching was now accompanied by a soft thumping, as if something was trying to get out. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He hesitated, then slowly turned his head toward the closet door. His eyes adjusted to the darkness. That's when he saw them. 2 glowing eyes, piercing and red. They shone through the crack in the closet door like twin embers burning in the dark. Michael froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The eyes didn't blink, didn't look away. They just stared at him, waiting. In a burst of panic, Michael leapt from the bed and slammed the closet door shut. His hands were shaking as he locked it. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He leaned against the door, trying to collect himself, but the room felt too small, too suffocating. Claire had stirred in her sleep, but she didn't wake. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed. She would have thought he was crazy, just like before. But he knew what he'd seen. The next morning, the house was quiet, too quiet. Michael tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest, but every time he glanced at the closet, he felt that same unease. The eyes were gone, but something still lingered. As the days passed, things only got worse. The shadows under the closet door began to grow longer, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching out. Each night, the scratching grew louder, closer. It wasn't just coming from the closet anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the floor. The whole room felt alive, like the house was breathing, waiting. Michael tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just his imagination, just the house settling. But then, one night the shadows began to move. They crept from under the door, slow and deliberate, like they had a mind of their own. The edges of the shadows seemed to shift and stretch, as if something was pushing through. Michael watched, frozen in place, as they grew bolder. Inch by inch, they crawled toward him, across the floor, over the bed, as though they were alive. The scratching continued, louder now, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Michael could no longer pretend. This wasn't just a noise. This wasn't just a shadow. There was something in that closet. Something that had been waiting for years, and it wasn't content with just watching anymore. He grabbed the nearest object he could find, a heavy lamp, and backed away from the closet door, his eyes fixed on the growing shadows. The closet door rattled, as if something inside was trying to break through. The air was thick, choking him, and his pulse raced as the shadows continued their crawl toward him. He had to do something. With a shaky hand, Michael threw the lamp at the door, hoping the impact would stop whatever was inside. But the shadows didn't stop. They didn't even flinch. They just kept coming. In a moment of pure terror, Michael bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running until he was outside, standing on the front porch, gasping for breath. He looked back at the house, the windows dark and empty. He could still feel the weight of the closet, the eyes watching him from within. He didn't go back inside that night, and he didn't go back the next. The house stood silent in the dark. The shadows in the closet were still there, waiting. Story number 3. The Mirror's Reflection. Julia never expected much from her grandmother's old house. It was a place she had visited countless times as a child, dusty, creaky, and filled with the smell of lavender and old books. But when her grandmother passed away, Julia was left with more than just memories. She inherited the house, along with a handful of things that didn't seem to hold much value. That's how she came to own the mirror. It was an antique, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings that Julia found charming, but a bit out of place in her modern apartment. She wasn't sure why her grandmother had kept it all these years. It had always hung on the wall of the guest room, gathering dust, rarely used. When Julia moved in, she decided to hang it in her own bedroom, thinking it would add some character to the space. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The mirror reflected her just like any other, showing the faint outline of her figure as she brushed her hair, got dressed, or adjusted the curtains. But as the days passed, something strange started to happen. Julia couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. It was small, almost unnoticeable, like when you're sure you've heard a sound, but you can't quite remember what it was. She'd catch herself moving in front of the mirror, and for a brief moment she'd notice that her reflection wasn't exactly the same. It wasn't anything huge, just a flick of her wrist, a tilt of her head, but it was enough to make her pause. The first time she noticed it, she thought it was just her imagination. She had been brushing her teeth, staring at her reflection, when she saw her hand move in a way she hadn't done. It was subtle, a quick twitch of her fingers, but the reflection mirrored it perfectly. When she glanced down at her real hand, it was still. She thought maybe it was just the light, the angle of the mirror, or maybe even her own tired eyes playing tricks on her. But it didn't stop there. As the days turned into weeks, the discrepancies grew. Julia would walk into her bedroom, and her reflection would be there, waiting for her. But sometimes it would be doing something that she hadn't done yet. Her reflection would tilt its head at a strange angle before she moved, or it would lift a hand as if to wave. But Julia hadn't even thought of waving. One night, after a long day at work, Julia stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection as she removed her earrings. She caught a flicker from the corner of her eye. Her reflection was smiling. But Julia hadn't smiled. She hadn't even thought about smiling. The reflection smiled at her, its lips curling upward in a way that made her stomach twist. Julia quickly turned away, convinced that it was just her mind playing tricks, but when she glanced back, the smile was still there. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was the fatigue from moving into a new place, dealing with her grandmother's estate and adjusting to a new life. But the more she looked, the more she realized something wasn't right. The mirror wasn't just reflecting her, it was doing something else. Something that didn't make sense. The worst part came one night when she woke up suddenly. It was around 3 a.m., the darkness thick and still. Julia had trouble sleeping ever since the strange happening started, but this time it felt different. The air in the room was heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. She opened her eyes and looked across the room. The mirror caught the moonlight from the window, and for a moment it looked like the reflection was waiting. Julia froze. Her reflection was standing still, but not in the way she had left it. It was looking directly at her, eyes wide, unblinking. Her own eyes were closed, but the reflections were open, staring into the darkness. The fear crawled up her spine, cold and sharp. She felt a knot form in her stomach, something primal telling her to look away, to run. But she couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, her breath shallow. The reflection started to move then. Slowly at first, as if it was testing the air. Julia watched, horror-stricken, as her reflection reached up and touched the glass. It wasn't like the normal movements. This was deliberate, slow. Her reflection was pressing its fingers against the surface of the mirror, as though it was trying to push through. Julia bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. She swung her legs over the side, trying to steady her shaking hands. She looked back at the mirror, but the reflection had returned to its usual stillness. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a pillow, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass rattled but didn't crack. She quickly pulled the blanket from the bed, yanking it over her head and clutching it to her chest. The next morning, she wasn't sure if she had dreamed at all, but the mirror was still there, hanging on the wall, waiting. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just reflecting her anymore. It was like the reflection had a mind of its own, a mind that was starting to get bolder. Julia couldn't bring herself to look in the mirror anymore. She started to avoid it at all costs, but the mirror seemed to call to her, pulling her in with every glance. Her reflection no longer obeyed her commands. It moved when it shouldn't, smiled when it shouldn't, and looked at her like it knew something she didn't. One day, Julia couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the mirror from the wall, her hands trembling, and moved to the door. She could feel the reflection watching her, feeling its gaze burning into her back. But as she stepped outside, ready to get rid of it for good, she stopped. The reflection wasn't the only thing looking back at her. Behind her, in the glass, a shadow loomed, tall and dark, watching her every move. The reflection wasn't hers anymore, and it wasn't alone. Julia ran, but the shadow followed, always one step behind, growing bolder with every step she took. The mirror's reflection had come to life, and now she had nowhere to hide. Story number 4. The Empty Crib. James and Mary had been through something no parent should ever have to experience. Their little girl, Emma, had been taken from them far too soon. It was a quiet kind of heartbreak, the kind that settled deep into their bones and never quite let go. They tried to go on, tried to move forward, but the house they once shared with Emma felt different, empty. Every corner seemed to echo her absence. The crib, The one they'd assembled together with such hope and love still stood in the corner of their bedroom. It had been months, but Mary couldn't bring herself to remove it. She couldn't let go of it, not yet. She would sit beside it sometimes, running her fingers along the soft, faded blanket, remembering the day Emma had been born. Those memories were sharp, too sharp. The pain was raw. One night it happened. James was half awake, the sheets tangled around his legs, the cool night air creeping through the window. He could hear Mary's soft breathing beside him, deep and even. But then, there it was. A soft cry, the kind of cry that no parent could mistake. A baby's cry. James blinked, his heart leaping into his throat. He sat up, his eyes darting around the room. The crib was empty as it had been for months. There was no one there. No Emma. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the grief creeping in and distorting reality. But then the cry came again, faint but unmistakable. A baby crying in the dead of night. "Mary," he whispered, shaking her gently. "Mary, did you hear that?" She groggily turned to face him. "What? Hear what?" "The baby. The crying. It's coming from the crib," he said, his voice trembling. Mary furrowed her brow, half asleep. "James, you're hearing things. It's just the grief. It's making you hear things." But James wasn't so sure. The cry was real, too persistent. The next night, the cry came again. This time, James couldn't ignore it. He lay awake, listening, his eyes fixed on the crib in the corner of the room. His heart raced, his mind spinning. It wasn't just his imagination. He could hear it clearly now, the soft whimpering, the faint pitiful cries of a child. It didn't stop. He got out of bed and walked over to the crib, his feet dragging against the cold wooden floor. He peered inside, his breath catching in his chest. It was empty, just as it should have been. But the crying didn't stop. James closed his eyes, rubbed his face, and tried to shake off the overwhelming feeling of dread creeping up his spine. Maybe it was just the house, still haunted by the memory of their daughter. Maybe it was just his grief, playing tricks on him. He turned to go back to bed, but then he froze. The crib wasn't empty anymore. At first, he thought he was dreaming. But no, the figure in the crib was real. It was small, curled up, just like Emma used to be when she slept. The shape was familiar, but there was something wrong with it. It was too still, too unnatural. And the crying, soft and continuous, sounded muffled, as if it were coming from something not quite human. James took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what he was seeing. The shape in the crib shifted just slightly, and that's when he saw it clearly. It wasn't Emma. The thing in the crib had the same small body, the same shape, but its face was wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly, and its eyes were wide open, black and glossy like a doll's. Its mouth was open, but instead of a cry, there was a low, gurgling sound, like something trapped, something desperate. "James?" Mary's voice came from behind him, shaky and afraid. He turned, and for a moment, the world felt like it had stopped spinning. Mary was standing in the doorway, staring at the crib with wide eyes. She saw it too. She saw the thing in the crib, but she couldn't speak. Neither of them could. They were both frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The crying grew louder, more frantic, more real. It sounded like it was coming from inside their heads now, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, the thing in the crib stopped crying. It turned its head slowly, inch by inch, as if it were studying them. Its eyes locked onto James, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something there, something that looked like recognition. It smiled at him, a wide, twisted grin that stretched too far across its face. It wasn't Emma, but it knew them. The thing reached out from the crib, its tiny fingers curling, and James had to fight every instinct not to run. He had to get out. He had to get away. But when he tried to turn, Mary was still frozen in place, staring at the creature. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from it. James grabbed her arm and yanked her away, pulling her out of the room and slamming the door behind them. They stood in the hallway, gasping for air, but the sound of the crying continued. It followed them, even behind the door. They couldn't leave. They couldn't escape. The thing in the crib wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. Story number 5. The bed that never sleeps. Lena never had trouble sleeping. She'd always been the type to climb into bed, pull the covers up to her chin, and drift off into a deep, peaceful slumber. There was never any tossing or turning, no staring at the ceiling, no restless nights. Sleep had always come easy for her. Until the bed. It started when Lena bought an old antique bed frame at a garage sale. She'd seen it sitting there, tucked away in a corner under a pile of old sheets and knickknacks. The wood was dark, almost black, and the intricate carvings on the headboard were worn with age. But there was something about it that drew her in. Maybe it was the promise of history, of stories tucked into its grooves, or maybe it was just the price. Cheap enough that it wouldn't hurt to try. She set it up in her bedroom, replacing her old bed with the new one, feeling a little thrill as she sank into the soft, new mattress. It was a change, something new, and she liked it. But that night something changed. At first, it was just a slight discomfort, a feeling she couldn't shake, like the bed was sinking a little too deep into the floor. She tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nothing. It was probably just her mind playing tricks after a long day. But the next night it happened again. And the night after that. The bed felt alive. Not in the way a person is alive, but in a way that made Lena feel small and helpless. It was as if the bed had its own presence, its own will. Each time she lay down, the mattress seemed to sink deeper into the floor, as if it were pulling her down, dragging her into the very foundation of the house. Lena tried to ignore it, telling herself she was just tired, that the bed was old, and maybe the floor wasn't perfectly level. But the sensation grew stronger, and the more she lay there, the more she felt as if she was being pulled into something dark and heavy. One night, after hours of trying to get comfortable, Lena sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked down at the floor beneath the bed, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no sign of what was pulling at her. She stood up, her knees weak, and moved to the other side of the room, away from the bed. But as soon as she stepped away, she felt the pressure on her chest, as if something invisible was pressing down on her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, only to feel it again. Stronger this time. The bed wasn't just pulling her down now, it was pressing in on her, suffocating her with its dark presence. Lena rushed to the door, desperate to escape, but as soon as she reached for the handle, the bed seemed to follow her, like it was tethered to her very soul. She could feel it, a weight against her back, pressing in from behind, its dark presence inching closer until she couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, the walls closing in on her, and she felt the room spin as her vision blurred. She tried to run, she tried to leave the room, but every step she took, the bed was there. It wasn't just the mattress. It was the very air around her, wrapping itself around her chest, squeezing the life out of her. It felt like the bed was alive and hungry, like it was trying to pull her into its depths, to swallow her whole. But no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. The bed followed her wherever she went, its presence relentless, pressing in on her, pushing her closer to the edge. The only way she could escape the suffocating weight was to wake up, to somehow snap out of it. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't. She had no control. It was like she was trapped in a nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from. Every night the bed pulled her in deeper, and every time she thought she was free, it followed her, waiting, watching. Lena was losing herself. She had become a prisoner to the bed, to the weight that never let her breathe, to the dark presence that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing night. And no matter how much she fought, how much she screamed or begged, the bed never let her go. The only escape, it seemed, was waking up. But the longer she tried, the harder it became. The bed had a hold on her, a grip she couldn't escape, and Lena knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the bed that would never sleep, it was her. And she was stuck in this dark, suffocating nightmare, forever trapped in a world where the bed never stopped pulling, never stopped pressing. Story number 6, The Whispers Under the Bed. Mark had never been a nervous person. He had spent most of his life dealing with the usual worries, work, bills, relationships, but nothing ever really scared him. That was until he moved into the new apartment. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but it was the first place he could call his own after a rough breakup and some tough months. The apartment was old, the kind of place that had character. The wooden floors creaked, and the wallpaper peeled slightly at the edges. But Mark didn't mind. It was home now, and after a few days of settling in, he was starting to feel comfortable. But that comfort didn't last long. The first night it happened, Mark woke up to a sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind, blowing against the window. It was a soft whisper, barely audible, like a murmur in the distance. He rolled over, checked his phone for the time, and then went back to sleep, dismissing it as nothing more than his mind playing tricks in the dark. But the next night it came again. That same whisper, just as faint as before. Mark tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the building settling or the wind outside. Still, it lingered at the edge of his consciousness, gnawing at him. He turned over in bed, pulling the covers tighter around his shoulders, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay there, wide awake, listening to the faint, indistinct murmurs. The third night was when it started to feel different. The whispers weren't just random noises anymore. They seemed to be getting closer, more distinct, and they were calling his name. Mark. He jolted awake, heart racing. The voice was so clear, so real. He sat up, looking around the room, but there was nothing there. The darkness in the apartment felt thick, like it was pressing in on him. He turned on the lamp beside his bed, but the room was still empty, still silent. He convinced himself it was just his imagination, but the whispers didn't stop. Every night they came, growing louder and more persistent, until it felt like someone was standing right next to him, whispering just out of reach. One night, Mark woke to the sound of his name being called again. Only this time, it didn't stop at Mark. The voice, low and cold, whispered in a tone that made his skin crawl. Mark, come closer. His breath caught in his throat. He sat up in bed, the room eerily quiet except for the rush of his pulse in his ears. He was starting to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. He could feel the whispers in his bones now, like they were coming from inside his head, urging him to listen, to follow them. He had to know what it was. Mark hesitated, his eyes scanning the dark room. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly swung his legs over the side of the bed. The air in the room felt colder now, heavier. He stood up, his legs shaky, and moved toward the source of the sound, the space under the bed. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, echoing around him as if the walls themselves were speaking. He dropped to his knees, swallowing his fear, and peered under the bed. It was empty. The floor beneath the bed was covered in dust, old and untouched. There were no shadows hiding there, no creature lurking in the dark. Just the dusty floor and the quiet emptiness of the space. Mark let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish for even considering that there might have been something under there. He stood up, brushing the dust off his knees, and turned back toward the bed. But as he did, he heard it again. "Mark." The voice was coming from behind him. His heart dropped to his stomach and he spun around, his eyes wide with panic. But there was nothing there. The room was silent, the air thick and still. He moved toward the bed, the whispers following him. They were in the walls now, the floorboards, the very air around him. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to listen. The whispers weren't just outside of him anymore. They were inside. They were a part of him. Mark sank to the floor, clutching his head in his hands as the whispers grew louder, more demanding, until they were all he could hear, all he could feel. His name echoed through his mind like a chant, pulling him deeper into the darkness. And as he listened, as he gave in to the pull of those voices, he knew that the whispers would never stop. They had found him, trapped him in the silence of his own mind, and now they would never let him go. Story number 7. The Red Handprint. Lily had always been a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts, in curses, or in anything that couldn't be explained by science. She liked things neat and tidy, everything in its place. So when she first saw the handprint on the bedroom wall, she didn't panic. She just assumed it was a prank. It was the strangest thing, though. A bright red handprint smeared across the wall near the corner, as if someone had placed their hand there and pressed down hard. The color was deep, almost like blood, but there was no blood. The wall around it was perfectly clean. No splatters, no stains, just the handprint standing out against the pale wallpaper. Probably a joke, Lily muttered to herself when she saw it. Her boyfriend, Tom, had a twisted sense of humor, and she thought he was just messing with her. Maybe he'd gotten into some fake blood for Halloween or something. But when she mentioned it to him, Tom was just as puzzled as she was. "I didn't do it," he said, shaking his head. "You sure you're not just imagining it?" Lily wasn't so sure. But after checking the whole room and finding nothing else out of place, she shrugged it off. She'd just clean it up in the morning. But the next night the handprint was back. And this time, it was bigger. Lily stared at it in disbelief. There was no way this could be happening. She even tried wiping it off, using a damp cloth, but the red stain wouldn't budge. It was as if it was part of the wall itself, as if the wall had absorbed it. She tried not to think about it, told herself it was just some strange trick of the light, or her eyes playing tricks on her. But as the days passed, it only got worse. Every night the handprint grew. By the third night, it had spread across a good part of the wall, the red expanding like a stain that wouldn't stop. And the strangest thing was that the handprint looked like it was fresh every time. Still wet, still glossy, as if someone had just pressed their hand against the wall moments ago. Lily couldn't take it anymore. She called Tom at work and told him to come home right away. "We need to figure this out," she said, voice shaking. Tom didn't believe her either. But when he saw it for himself, his face went pale. "I don't know what this is," he said quietly, touching the wall, his fingers coming away with no trace of anything. The print wasn't wet, it just looked fresh, like it had been painted there with something other than paint. And then, one night, Lily woke up with a start. The room was cold. So cold. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, shivering as she glanced around the room. It was still dark, the moonlight barely peeking through the curtains. And then she saw it. The handprint wasn't where it had been before. It had moved. It was closer to her bed. Much closer. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She could feel it. The cold. The air around the handprint felt like ice, a sharp, biting chill that made her skin crawl. Her breath came out in shaky gasps, the temperature in the room dropping so quickly that she could see her own breath fogging in the air. She stared at the wall, unable to move, unable to look away. The handprint seemed to pulse, as if it was alive. She could see the outline of the fingers now, each one curling toward her, inch by inch. Lily's throat tightened as she realized something else. The cold was moving too. She could feel it. Feel the air shift. Feel the space around her grow colder, like the handprint was reaching out to her, inching toward her bed. She could almost hear it. A faint scraping sound, like fingers dragging against the wall. The handprint was moving. She backed up against the headboard, her body shaking with fear, eyes wide. The handprint wasn't just growing anymore, it was moving toward her, toward her bed. And then she felt it. A brush of cold air, so sharp it took her breath away, as if the fingers had touched her skin. The cold crawled across her face, a sickening sensation that made her want to scream. But she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The handprint was just inches from her now, the fingers almost reaching her, and in that moment Lily knew this was no prank. This wasn't something Tom had done. This wasn't a trick of the light. Something was in that room with her. Something that had been there all along, waiting to reach out. And as she lay there, frozen in terror, she knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard she tried to run, the handprint would never stop. It would always be there, creeping closer every night until it finally touched her. Until it finally claimed her. Story number 8. The Disappearing Bed. Jacob had never been the type to wake up in the middle of the night. He was a heavy sleeper, the kind of person who would sleep through an alarm or a thunderstorm. But that night was different. He jolted awake, the room darker than usual, colder than usual. For a moment he lay still, trying to figure out what had woken him. His eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from the street lamp outside, and he realized that something was off. He could feel it in the air, the heaviness, like something was waiting. Then he looked down. The bed. It was gone. Jacob blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The space where his bed had been was now empty. The blankets, the pillows, everything was just gone. There was only the cold floor beneath him, the wooden boards creaking under his weight as he shifted his legs over the side of the bed, trying to get a grip on what was happening. "Okay, this is just a dream," Jacob muttered to himself, standing up. He was groggy, his mind foggy with sleep. Maybe he'd just gotten up too quickly. Maybe he was disoriented. But the floor felt too cold against his feet, the silence too thick. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the shadows, trying to convince himself this wasn't happening. The closet door was shut tight. The window was slightly cracked, letting in a cool draft. Everything seemed normal, except for the bed, or, rather, the lack of it. Jacob took a step forward, feeling the chill crawl up his spine. He walked over to where the bed had been, hoping to see it tucked away under the blankets or maybe shoved to the side, but there was nothing. Just the empty floorboards. He stood there for a long time, frozen, unsure of what to do. Maybe he was still dreaming. Maybe it would all make sense in the morning. But then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. The bed began to reappear. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape rising up from the floor. Jacob blinked again, rubbed his eyes, but the shape was still there, slowly taking form. The bed. It was coming back into place, the wooden frame solidifying from nothingness. The mattress slowly lifting up as if pulled by some invisible hand. Jacob took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't right. The bed, it wasn't the same. The wood was darker, the lines of the frame twisted in ways he didn't remember. The headboard had strange, swirling shapes carved into it. Shapes that didn't look like any kind of design he had ever seen. They seemed to move, shifting like shadows under the surface of the wood, their edges jagged and sharp. The bed was wrong. Jacob took another step back, feeling his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He had to get out. He had to leave. But his feet felt stuck to the floor. His body refused to move. The bed finished reappearing, settling back into its place in the center of the room. But it was darker now, and the twisted patterns in the wood seemed to pulse, to shift as though they were alive. Jacob's mind raced, panic starting to claw its way up his throat. He turned away, but just as he did, the bed seemed to shift again, like it was adjusting itself, getting closer. The air felt colder now, like a thick, oppressive fog had rolled in around him. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of it, pressing down on him, the heaviness of the room wrapping around him like a blanket. He turned back to the bed. The patterns in the wood were twisting now, shifting faster, like they were trying to reach for him. He couldn't look away. And then the bed moved. It wasn't a big movement, not at first, just a slight shift, like it was sliding closer to him. But with every passing second, it seemed to get darker, more twisted. The edges of the frame curled, as if the wood itself was bending in unnatural ways. And the shapes on the headboard, they looked almost like faces now. Faces that were watching him, their eyes following his every movement. Jacob's breath came in short, frantic gasps. He took a step back, stumbling, his body finally responding to the fear coursing through him. But no matter how far he moved, the bed kept inching toward him, the wood creaking, the air thickening with each passing moment. The bed was coming for him. He turned, ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side, a force he couldn't explain. He turned back to the bed, his hand shaking, his heart racing. It was too late. The bed was almost at the edge of the room now, the twisted shapes on the wood reaching out for him. The faces on the headboard staring with hollow eyes. Jacob tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. And then, with a final, horrifying jolt, the bed reached him. The last thing Jacob felt before everything went dark was the cold wood, its sharp edges pressing into his skin, pulling him down into the twisted shadows. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the bed was gone. Just an empty room. Just the cold, empty floor. Story number 9. The Watcher in the Curtains. Ellie had always loved her small, quiet bedroom. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the noise of the world. The soft, pale blue curtains framed her window perfectly, letting just enough light in from the street lamp outside to make the room feel cozy. She'd always felt safe there, tucked in bed with a book, listening to the quiet hum of the night. But then, it started. At first, Ellie didn't think much of it. She'd noticed the curtains were pulled back slightly, just enough for her to see a faint shadow outside, nothing more than a flicker at the edge of her vision. She assumed it was her imagination, or maybe the wind had moved them a little. The thought made sense, so she let it go. But then it happened again, and again. Each night, without fail, the curtains would be drawn just a little more. Not by much, but enough for her to catch sight of something out there. At first, it was nothing, just a shadow, a faint shape, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching her. One evening, as she settled into bed, she noticed the curtains were pulled back farther than usual. Ellie sat up, her heart skipping a beat. She could see something. 2 eyes peering through the gap, staring directly at her. They were dark, almost black, and unmoving. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They just stared at her from the darkness outside. Ellie froze. A chill ran down her spine. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just the shadows, but she couldn't look away. She sat there, holding her breath, watching the eyes. They didn't move. Not for a long while. But then, slowly, almost deliberately, the eyes shifted. Just a little, like they were adjusting to get a better view of her. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. The eyes were still there, unblinking, and now they seemed to be watching her, waiting for something. Ellie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her breathing became shallow, panicked. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. It was like the eyes were pulling her in, locking her in place, making her unable to move. After what felt like forever, Ellie finally forced herself to close her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the sensation of being watched didn't go away. She had to do something. She grabbed the edge of the curtains, her fingers trembling, and yanked them shut with all her strength. The movement was quick and sharp, but when the fabric covered the window, the sense of being watched didn't fade. Ellie stood there, frozen. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she was being paranoid. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The eyes had been real. Terrified, Ellie climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but she couldn't. The darkness outside the window felt heavier now, pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. She stared at the wall, her eyes wide, heart thudding in her chest. She tried to fall asleep, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay there in the silence, every small sound making her jump, every shadow in the corner of the room sending a surge of fear through her body. Then, just as she was starting to drift off, something made her open her eyes. She turned her head toward the window, almost afraid to look. And there they were, the eyes. The curtains were open again. The gap was slightly wider this time, and those dark, unblinking eyes were staring at her again, right through the window, as if they had never moved, never left. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her body froze in place, the fear now more intense than before. She quickly pulled the covers over her head, trying to shut out the sight, but the eyes were still there, still watching her from the darkness. No matter how tightly she shut her eyes, no matter how deep she buried herself in her blankets, she couldn't escape them. The worst part was that they didn't go away. No matter how many times she closed the curtains, they were always there when she opened her eyes. It was as if whatever or whoever was outside her window was waiting, patiently watching, knowing that Ellie could never escape the feeling of being seen. And the longer she stayed in that room, the more she realized that it wasn't just her imagination anymore. The eyes were real, and they were never going to stop watching. Story number 10. The Haunting of the Attic. Jenny had always been excited about moving into her own apartment. It wasn't anything grand, just a small one-bedroom on the top floor of an old building. The landlord had warned her that it was an older place, with some quirks, but Jenny didn't mind. She liked the character of the old building, the creaky floors, the narrow hallways, the way the light streamed in through the dusty windows. It felt like home, even if it was a little worn around the edges. The landlord mentioned the attic when she was showing Jenny around. "It hasn't been used for years," he said. "Locked up tight. You don't need to worry about it. The key's lost anyway." Jenny thought nothing of it. She was more focused on the rest of the apartment, the cozy kitchen and the small balcony with a view of the street below. The attic was just an afterthought. That was until one night. It was late, and Jenny had just finished reading a book in bed. She was about to turn off the light when she heard it, a heavy thump. It came from above, directly above her bedroom, like something had fallen or someone had dropped something heavy. The sound was so distinct it made her sit up in bed, her heart thumping in her chest. She waited, but the noise didn't come again. Maybe it was a neighbor, she thought. Maybe something had shifted in the building. But then the thump came again, louder this time, more forceful. Jenny got out of bed, her feet cold against the floor. She stood in the middle of the room, straining her ears, trying to make sense of it. The thumping had stopped. Silence stretched out around her like a thick blanket. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and walked out into the hallway. The building was quiet, too quiet. She tiptoed up the narrow stairs that led to the attic door. The landlord had said it was locked, but as she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. The attic door was slightly ajar. Jenny's stomach tightened. She hadn't heard the door creak open. It had been locked, hadn't it? But there it was, the small gap between the door and the frame, just enough for her to see the darkness beyond. She reached out, her hand shaking, and pushed the door open. The air that hit her was thick, damp, and cold. She stood there in the doorway, peering into the attic, but there was nothing. Just the shadows and the empty space. The dust-covered floor looked undisturbed, and there were no signs of anyone being up there. Still, something felt wrong. The silence felt oppressive, like something was waiting in the dark. Jenny stepped back, a shiver running down her spine. She didn't know why, but she felt the overwhelming urge to leave the door open, just a crack. She closed it gently behind her and returned to her bedroom, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled over her. She told herself it was nothing. A creaky old house, maybe a squirrel in the walls. But the dread wouldn't leave her. The next night, it came again. The thump. Louder this time. It echoed through the ceiling, making the walls shake. Jenny froze, her heart racing in her chest. She glanced up at the ceiling, her eyes wide in the dark. And then, as if to answer her fear, the sound changed. It wasn't just a thump anymore. It was something else. A whisper, low, guttural, almost like it was coming from the very walls around her. Jenny. Her name. Her heart skipped a beat. Her legs turned to jelly, but she forced herself to get up. She grabbed her phone, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped it. The thumping continued, accompanied by the whispers. "Jenny, come up here." The sound was so real, so close. Jenny's blood ran cold. She had to know what was going on. She had to check the attic again to prove to herself that it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. She stepped into the hallway, and the air was colder than before. The stairs creaked under her feet as she moved toward the attic. She didn't stop. She didn't even think about it. She pushed the door open. The attic was darker this time, the shadows deeper. The whispering was louder now, like a voice pulling her in, urging her forward. She stepped inside, her phone flashlight cutting through the dark. And then she saw it. A shape. A figure in the corner, just out of reach of the light. It was hunched, unmoving, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't human, not in any way she recognized. Its skin was pale, stretched too tightly across its bones, and its fingers seemed to twitch, as if it were waiting for her to approach. The whispering stopped. But then, a voice, low and familiar, called her name again. Jenny. It wasn't the same voice. It was something else. Something that sounded hungry. Come closer, Jenny. A scream lodged in Jenny's throat. But before she could react, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward her, and its eyes gleamed in the dark. Jenny ran. She bolted out of the attic, down the stairs and back into her apartment, slamming the door behind her. She locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling. The thumping stopped. The whispering stopped. But Jenny knew it wasn't over. The thing in the attic was waiting, and no matter how far she ran, it would always be there, watching, waiting, for her to return.